Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With us today is Chris Rossini, our co-host. Chris, welcome to the program.
Happy Friday, Dr. Paul. Great to be with you.
Well, very good. Guess what? We're going to talk about war and economics. Seems like there's a few problems in both areas, except maybe they're related. Economic policy has a lot to do with going to war and fighting war, and wars have a lot to do with interfering with sound economic policy. So we do want to talk about that and specifically talk about how some of this has affected not only all wars, but the one that's going on, because wars have to be paid for, and that's an economic issue, and there's always winners and losers, mostly losers. But the instigators are generally the winners, and I'm referring to the military-industrial complex. They do pretty well, and the people who have to pay are the victims of the inflation that's created, and also who have to fight the wars. And that, of course, are the poor people that don't have a powerful lobbying arm in Washington like the military-industrial complex goes. So it is a major problem, and the people are, of course, very concerned about it because it never seems to end, and we're in the middle of this terrible result of the NATO-type policy that we have in Ukraine, and there's a lot of projection of what's going to come of this. But anyway, it's a mess. People are, talking how far will the Russians go, or are they going to take over Kiev? Are they going to take over all of Europe? Are going to take over all the world? And so there's a lot of speculation. The one thing, Chris, that we've mentioned already in trying to sort all this out is the refusal to recognize and talk about, some of the mistakes that NATO might have made. NATO, they sort of paint them as, the perfect arbitrators. But that is not the case if you look at it as we do it, everything going on. But it precipitates, it starts with problems, but they always expand. And we're talking about the consequence of wars, at least when they're foolishly started. But a lot of them are intended, but a lot of the consequences are unintended consequences of war. And I think that's what's going on now. But when I started making my list, Chris, I had a long list, so we probably can't go over all the consequences that we find related, to the war and the false promises and policies that led up to the war. There's always rehash as later people go over this and say, well, why did we do this? Why did we do that? They've already started it, but right now, the main thing in Washington is get more money, and make sure it's bipartisan. So Adam Schiff, who's chairman of the major committee dealing with the foreign policy, and he says that we should, send some more money. So the person in charge of the funding of this, Coons, says, well, they're proposing and talking about $10 billion to help clean up the mess. They're already talking about how to help clean up the mess. But the chairman of the financial committee says, no, $10 billion won't do it. Because let me tell you how ridiculous this gets. Because he says Friday morning that any supplemental funding bill would likely exceed $10 billion, the majority of which would go toward humanitarian aid to address the impending refugee crisis in Europe. I keep thinking, don't we have a refugee problem already in this country? Aren't we flat out broke? And who believes the government when they say, well, we're in this for humanitarian reasons? That's why we went to Iraq and Afghanistan, for humanitarian reasons. And the saying goes, as soon as somebody comes and talks about humanitarian efforts, you better run and hide, because they're after either your life or your money or both. And that's a consequence of war that seems to be universal. Basically, in the big picture that I see, I think there's a problem with the human race, because the wars have been going on for a long time, and it's been predicted that they're going to last a long time. But I think from the beginning of time, it's been recognized that there is a higher law, a law that really recognizes truth and honesty. War separates the war and peace, and they can sort it out of what is right and wrong. And on the other side of that are the people who outrightly refuse to believe there is a higher law, and they become the militant dictators, and they're the ones who philosophically aren't bothered by the killing. They're bothered only if they didn't get a lot of benefits from it. So that contest is going on, and I can see that in this operation. There are people, when I was in Congress and all those Middle Eastern wars going on, and a lot of suffering and dying, the remorse of the people who were gung-ho over that war, and especially the leadership in our country, there was no remorse about it. There was no guilt feeling. They had no sense of guilt that something was wrong. And I think that's the basic problem. And then all of a sudden, if you don't have a basic principle, if you don't have a higher law, you don't even know what you strive for. And the people who are on the other side say, why do it? There is no such thing as truth. Don't even look for it. So we can do whatever we want. And I guess the Federal Reserve sort of must fit into that category, although most people would say, what are you talking about? No, they don't care if people suffer, and they really don't have a conscience. So anyway, Chris, I know you've looked at this issue a bit, and I'm sure you're filled with a lot of ideas and a lot of problems that we can see, but why don't you let us know what you've been thinking about?
That's right, Dr. Paul. And as you all know, the first casualty in war is the truth. And boy, we just went through 2 solid years of COVID lies. Now we're transitioning back to war lies. And we're talking about the economic aspects of it, and it's not very hard to see. I mean, look over the last 2 years. Look at Big Pharma, how they raked in billions and billions of dollars, with government force. And we're just switching back now to the kings of cronyism, and that's the military contractors. They already, take us for almost $1 trillion a year, just as a matter of course. One could imagine that $1 trillion is not going to be enough to do whatever they think they need to do. And all of this cronyism, it destroys productive economic activity. All these resources are allocated to these things versus the things that we actually would want in a market economy. And there's tremendous waste. The military waste is legendary in the military. But we also saw with what we just went through, the vaccine waste. Governments spent our tax money buying all of these vaccines, and now the vaccines are collecting dust, because people don't need them and they don't want them. But the Big Pharma got paid, so if they collect dust and go in the trash, our money went to them nevertheless. So this is the system we live in, and they just go back and forth, whether it's Wall Street or the military or Big Pharma. They just take turns in ripping us off. They're different actors, and they just get their couple of years in, and they're off. And the only way to stop this, it's very hard for most people, is to stop believing them. But they're very, very good at scaring you into believing them. So, but look at how COVID ended. When did it stop? And people, they just don't believe it anymore. So, but again, at the very least, for you and your family, just stop believing what the cronies and the media and the government are putting in your face every single day.
Hey, Chris, you mentioned something which is very important because it leads us to war, it perpetuates the war, it deceives the people, and that is the issue of lying. And it's essentially required to get the people, willing to sacrifice so much to go to war. And statistically, the issues that I've dealt with in the last 20 years, generally speaking, the wars that we got into, if you took a poll at the beginning, the people were against it. Then the propagandists came in and they worked real hard and changed the opinion of the people. Then the people, we're going to get bombed and we have to do this. So they changed their mind. And then later on, the people recognize it, and it reverts back to, why did we ever do this? And of course, our goal at our institute is to try to get people to prevent this stuff. Why go through that process of listening to the demagogues? And you've already mentioned the big one perpetuator of this whole thing is the military-industrial complex, to try to scare everybody. But they do something else, and I think it is important, and Chris, you've alluded to it, that there's been a war against COVID too. So many of the principles are exactly the same. They're fought differently. somewhat differently, but they also recognize the same principles of why people go along with it. Didn't people have to get frightened to death in order to roll over and say, please give me more shots? Oh, how many do I need? How many masks do I need? How far do I have to separate myself? And people didn't like it. Then they got talked into it. Then they got to hating people who wouldn't follow the rules, and it goes on and on. But one thing is characteristic of both, whether it's COVID or fighting another Saddam Hussein. He was coming here to bomb us. That if you don't go along with it, if you don't support the troops, and that supporting the troops means you're supporting the military-industrial complex's ability to make a lot of profits, building more weapons for the troops. So if you don't support the troops and you don't support the doctors who have been coerced and pressured, and the scientists who say, "Oh, you got to have all these shots," and then finally they start to change their mind. But what do they say? This is so bad that they have to cancel out freedom of speech, and they tell people that if you do this, you're getting involved in prison, you're killing people. And good people who took a different position on COVID or on foreign policy, they say you're going to just allow Americans to be killed. And since I took this position in the Congress, frequently there were some pretty strong attacks saying that, oh, you don't dare, you don't care. The one thing that helped me a little bit in the military to make my case is generally speaking, of most of all the members we were talking to, they were never in the military. And it just happened that I had been in the military. And they don't like to put down people who had served in the military, serving their interests. But the one thing is they will lie to get into war, and they will lie to keep us in there. And the old saying is, lying is treason and an empire lies. And even if you don't have what somebody identifies as a war, the empire is still pretty important to maintain because it's a war against the people. Chris.
Right, Dr. Paul. And you and Daniel, I remember it was probably just a few weeks ago, we did a show, the COVID Berlin Wall is crashing down. Yeah. And it really has. The mandates have been lifted. The passports, the cities are ditching the passports. I see stadiums are ditching passports. So we could all finally go back to normal lives again, right? Not so fast. Look at the war that just popped up out of nowhere. And right away, they're transitioning to a war mentality. We're starting to hear from multiple places, sacrifices are going to have to be made. There's some kind of fight on the other side of the planet, and we, here in America, are going to have to sacrifice? We just went through 2 years of COVID tyranny where freedom was taken away from us like never before. People were losing their jobs, locked in their homes. They were losing their jobs from lockdowns, from refusing to get a product from a big pharma corporation, and we're now being asked to make sacrifices when that's all, at least for the time being, done. I mean, have you noticed that government never has to sacrifice ever anything? And this is how upside down it is. Our economy will never turn around unless these roles are reversed. It is government that has to sacrifice. It is government that has to have their powers taken away, not our freedoms. And when that reverses someday, hopefully we're alive to see it, our fortunes will reverse along with it.
Yeah, I think that's a very important issue that you bring up about the sacrifice, because I've taken a very firm position on that, and it was well received with the young people I visited with in the college campuses. And my statement was flat out, you don't need to ever sacrifice liberty, your liberty, for somebody else. It doesn't make any sense. And that was well received because that doesn't create liberty when you sacrifice your liberty. But we need that message, and I think it's so important. But the one thing about war, especially the kind of wars that we see all the weapons used and so much destruction, there's always psychological destruction and liberty denied people. But thinking about the wars that the 20th century was engaged in, including the Middle East wars, a lot of destruction goes on. And in the course of the destruction of wealth, there is also the redistribution of wealth. And the two of that is a source of problems that last for a long, long time. You just think of how our country had to suffer decades in the Reconstruction area of all this, of all the penalties paid for a war that need not have been fought. Which is also, right now, people still say, you can't say that. You can't say that. That was to stop slavery. That's why we had a civil war. They always have remained in denial that maybe there was an economic issue where the North was competing with the South. So that is something that goes on and on. So you're a very bad person if you don't agree with the authoritarians who are making a lot of money on it. And the one other thing on these hot wars, you have to be very, very much aware of the fact that who are the people who die are eventually maybe the really bad planners, and they could maybe point out that some of the Nazi leaders finally had their due, at the end of World War II. But, how many people have to die innocently? How many innocent people, civilians, died at the hands of American bombs? Whether somebody dropped the bombs for us or we dropped them ourselves in all those Middle Eastern wars, it wasn't like 100 or 1,000. And the displacements and all the people died from that. So that should be enough to say, boy, we should be more cautious of getting in, because sometimes people say, even after a 20-year war, people say, well, who won? Who won? People be hard pressed to say, oh, we won. We were fighting those Afghanis and we won the war. Oh, sure. Nobody believes that. And the wars, there are no real victors. Victors, the people who suffer and die and lose their wealth is just so numerous. But that is generally what happens. But if you're looking at age groups, it's mostly the young people. Young people, I'm thinking the people who get drafted or coerced or badgered into paying their patriotic duty to going into war. They're the ones who so often are killed in the front line or suffer, the people who never get measured in their suffering, post-traumatic stress syndrome. Just think how much of that happened. How many families get broken up that you never even hear about when people go over and their husband or father comes back and has lost 1, 2, 3 limbs? And that suffering goes on and on and on, and they really are ignored or highly praised for people who think who are trying to get something off their conscience, because I think deep down inside they know that so much of that carnage was not necessary. And I think there's the people who suffer are never the ones who really started the war. I always poke fun at that whole thing. If two countries get together, or say the young people of our country and the young people of another country get together, and they're between 18 and 24 at the draft age, and they get together, and the young people say, hey, don't you think our generation deserve a war too? Don't you think we should have a war? And they go out and start fighting and cause a war. That's so ridiculous. But that's essentially what happens, because the young people are sent to fight the wars and they suffer the consequences, and then they sow the seeds of the next war, like the first war, World War, sowed the seed for the second war, because there's so much maldistribution of wealth through the damage done to property as well as the damage done to the monetary system. And then all of a sudden there are new victims, and believe me, that type of victimhood does not do anything for the benefits of liberty.
Very good, Dr. Paul. I'm going to close up now by repeating something that we tend to repeat often, but it's so important. So our regular viewers will know this, but new viewers, it may be the first time they hear it. And that is, when you see the inflation, the shortages, the messed up economy, you have to keep your eye on the ball. The source of this is the Federal Reserve. Yet there's always, always, always another excuse to keep people looking away. Never look at the Fed. It was over the last several years, it was COVID. COVID is causing inflation and all these shortages and this and that. And now, amazingly, and I don't know who on earth believes this, they're trying to say that Ukraine is the source of our economic ills. It is not. It's the Federal Reserve. They are the unconstitutional institution that was created to counterfeit money, which no one should ever be allowed to do. And thus, they create economic bubbles and busts. They fund all the government expansion. Government can just have the money handed to them by the Fed. So it's no surprise that you're never supposed to look at the Fed, because they are the nucleus of this whole system that Dr. Paul and I have talked about today. You put an end to the Fed, you put an end to this whole scheme. So that's why they do not want you ever looking at it. They're anything and everything, even Ukraine, you'll be told to blame it on Ukraine for your economic ills. We're going to stick with the truth and say, keep your eye on the ball. It is the Federal Reserve. They need to someday be ended, and then these economic problems that we're so used to living with will be ended as well.
Very good, Chris. And I want to bring up that subject that I opened the program with, is that the $10 billion that they're assuming, and nobody's going to oppose it, and they'll pass, they'll get that passed, and they'll spend the $10 billion. Which they don't have. Where is it going to come from? They're going to borrow it. No, many people like borrowing money to us. Now we're $30 trillion in debt. That's a bad risk thing. And so who buys it up? The people who want the money, they print their own money in collaboration. The Fed prints the money for the planners of war. So that $10 billion, it doesn't even need, they'll go through the ritual of saying the people will speak out and we get the support from the politicians and we're going to get the $10 billion. But just think of, for every $10 billion that they appropriate in the open, there's probably $100 billion of shenanigans going on through that Federal Reserve System that Chris was talking about, because they can handle that by sending money to certain governments and certain corporations. And that's why this bubble, this financial bubble, is so big, but is coming apart, and that's what we have to prepare for. And it ends up, the wars against the American people, our war, all our war efforts is against the people, and certainly I claim that the young people are suffering more than anybody else. And yet it's used to promote and prepare for the next war. I just think that the answer to this is not difficult. They make it complicated for a purpose, and they change people's mind by propaganda, and they hide the bad stuff of war profiteering and political profiteering, and all these things are hidden because it's couched in humanitarian terms and nationalism. If you're not a good patriot, remember when after 9/11, anybody who voted against the Patriot Act, they weren't patriotic. It's probably the most unpatriotic thing you could have ever gotten a congressman to do on a local, a matter within our state is the Patriot Act. But no, it's always couched in those terms. So really, Chris, I think what we're talking about is sorting out the truth and getting people to open up their minds to it and say, maybe we ought to listen to something else and not wait until the next war has to be fought and until the one that's going on ends badly. Just think how long it went on in the first decade of this century. I mean, it was constant wars in the Middle East, and they're still going on. Matter of fact, what's happening now is, a continuation of all this activity, and they still resort to international organizations that will compensate for the inefficiencies of individual and nationalistic governments. That's why we have the UN to stop all wars, and that's why we have NATO. NATO will take care of us. We'll stop those communists. And then the communist menace disappears, but we still have to talk about it, so we have to find a new enemy, and we'll just change the looks of the next one is the enemy that we have to fight. There always has to be an enemy. People should wake up. The enemy so often is staring us in the face, and we don't have the authority or the power to change everybody in all the different countries and change their political system. But we do have a personal responsibility of dealing with our own country and trying to bring about common sense. And when I would give a talk like that on college campuses, people would raise their hand, what do we do? What do we have to do? How do we start? How do we solve this problem? I says, why don't we start by a new generation saying, They read the Constitution, and we're not supposed to be doing that stuff. We're going to tell the truth and do what we tell you we're going to do. But that was so strange. Well, you mean we wouldn't have a Federal Reserve? Right. Would we have an interventionist foreign policy? No. Would we have thousands and thousands of pages of regulations that nobody could comprehend? No, we'd burn all those. I mean, we wouldn't need them. But we'd have to have a belief in truth. We would have to understand what a higher law means and morality means. We'd have to understand that some people drift, because this contest always goes on, some people drift into what we see with the total authoritarians because they become nihilists. They claim, you guys are wasting your time. All this picking, there's no way you can find the truth. Yeah, there's probably very difficult for anybody to come up and say, I have the positive truth, the absolute positive truth. No, I think it's going to be a continuous process seeking the truth, and a lot of people understand that. And you know, what do you have to do? How am I going to do that? Just promise that you will never use force against people, against your neighbor, friends, or family, and that governments can't do it either. It wouldn't be any more complicated than that. And if you have an agreement, if you have a contract with somebody, follow through with it. Do what you say. And recognize the position that property belongs to the people, not to the political thugs that get control of it, because they control it, whether the title's in your name or not. They have total control of it by scaremongering and through inflationism and all the tactics. So it is there. But the principles of liberty are not complicated, and somebody will say, well, you mean you'd have to watch spending and you couldn't just print the money when you... That's right, because that's theft, it's counterfeit, it's immoral, it's not part of the higher law, and don't do it. But the best part about this, and people say, oh, I don't know if I can handle all that. The best part is, guess what? Whatever you do and earn, it's yours, and the government can't take it away from you. You don't have to deal with the IRS as long as you follow the rules and the people understand what property rights are. Believe me, it will work very well, and people will be much better off. The freer a society, the wealthier a society is. Right now, and I've written about this quite a bit over the last few years, we're getting poorer. And I think this last month or two is confirming the fact that we are getting poorer, and it won't be the creation of a new fiat currency or any of these things, or everybody buying a gold coin. So we have to understand what the principles of liberty are all about, and I think that effort is alive and well. I really do. I made a lot of people. I think there are good groups now looking at this. So I don't think it's a dead-end street, because the one reason is we don't have a lot of other options. I mean, we're not going to get a bunch of people together with bombs and guns and go over there and settle all the disputes around the world. The best we can do is believe in a principle of liberty and the principles of honesty, and set a standard, whether it's a standard for your family, your kids, your neighbors, but as a country, set a standard. And one time we were on our way to doing that. Right now, I don't think it's a shame, and I'm sad about the fact that we can't say, well, if everybody would look at the standards that we provide, it would be a wonderful world. And we still hear this. The politicians still say that. We are the champions of liberty. Just do like us. And I said, oh, that hurts my head when they say that. But anyway, and I really do come down the side of optimism, that a lot of people would like that free society that we talk about here on the Liberty Report. I want to thank everybody for tuning into the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.